think we're good to go. So hello everybody and welcome to the first Heritage Hour of 2025. I'm Turner Douglas, Program Coordinator with Heritage Services. Thank you so much to all of you for being here today. Heritage Hour takes place in Cataraqui on the traditional homeland of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Huron-Wendat. We are grateful for their care and stewardship over this land and for the opportunity to learn here together today. Today's speaker is Cassandra Giarrusso. Cassandra has recently completed her Master's in History at the University of Toronto. In the past, they have worked locally in interpretive roles at Marnie Tower and Fort Henry. Today, she will be sharing her knowledge about the history of Fort Frontenac and its role in New France's illegal fur trade. Please join me in welcoming Cassandra.
Hey there, everyone. So we're going to be talking about the illegal fur trade in Fort Frontenac. So Kingston, as you all know, has a long, storied history, most famously as the temporary capital of Canada and its more Anglophone history. But its history stretches far further than this. If you're ever driving past the causeway towards the Royal Military College or Fort Henry, you might see on that kind of diagonal plot of land a few piles of bricks and rubble. That is the topic of today, Fort Frontenac. It was part of New France's effort to expand its influence in a post-royal takeover period. And it was built incredibly enthusiastically by the Crown, its governors, and its really anybody involved. But only 10 years after its founding, it was once stated by a government official of New France as a refuge and entrepot for the vagabonds scattered among the Ottawa nations, which have formed trading connections in beavers with the Dutch, the English, at Albany and Manhattan. Fort Frontenac, in the imagination of the authorities of New France, was, to quote hit film Star Wars: A New Hope, a hive of scum and villainy. A place where officials, soldiers, and merchants participated in an illegal fur trade which ranged from the deepest woods of North America all the way to the metropoles of Europe. Fort Frontenac endured throughout some of New France's most trying periods, as it was on the verge of economic collapse and invasion from both Indigenous and American enemies. Yet it remained. So join me today as we're going to talk about Kingston's underworld history in a period long ago. So we're just going to be setting the scene now. This is a map of North America by the French in 1681, generally how they understood it. And this is a map of New France from approximately 1703, at least how they interpreted their imperial holdings. Our topic is really going to be taking place right here, right at the confluence of the St. Lawrence here and Lake Ontario, or as the French knew it, le Lac de Frontenac, with actually Fort Frontenac being right here. So, in the foundation of Fort Frontenac, there are two important figures that we need to talk about, and they are these two men here, Sieur René Robert de la Salle and Louis de Bode, le Comte de Frontenac. So we're going to start with de la Salle. So de la Salle, as some of you may know, he was a soldier, explorer, and fur trader. He was incredibly interested in expanding New France from its current borders at his time in New France, which was only really the St. Lawrence Valley, so Montreal, Quebec City, and a little bit into what would become Ontario today. He led several expeditions into Le Pays d'en Haut, or the upper country, that is just anywhere beyond Montreal and the west of that island. He explored the Mississippi and mapped out a lot of what would become Louisiana, but he was actually ordered to build Fort Frontenac at Cataraqui by the previous governor, le Gouverneur Coureurs, who was very interested in sort of safeguarding New France's borderlands in response to the Iroquois War that had only ended just about 10 years earlier. So he builds Fort Frontenac and is given the seigneurie and the right to trade, as well as the unspoken agreement that he would serve his patrons' interests. So the basics for Fort Frontenac, which you can see is located today in modern-day Kingston, just by Tragically Hip Way and King Street. So it's built in 1673. It takes just about 6 days to build it, though it's only a wooden fort with a wooden palisade. Stonework would be added later on in 1675. And as I mentioned, it's located at the confluence of the St. Lawrence and Lake Ontario. So it's a perfect location for trading, defense, and colonial sort of expansion and the pressing of force. The fort is firstly built for colonial defense and imperial expansion, and trade secondarily. Defense was a priority. Oftentimes, especially in the wars against the Haudenosaunee that lived on the south banks of Lake Ontario, they would often raid into New France. And Fort Frontenac was designed to really be one of the first ways to prevent the heartlands of New France from being invaded. Secondly, it was hoped that it could draw Haudenosaunee trade away from their English rivals in New York and New England. However, it was very controversial. This is mostly because the colonial authorities really questioned its validity. Oftentimes, it was given the task of settling the area, converting Indigenous peoples, but realistically, the fort wasn't actually really good at doing this, mostly because of corruption in the French authority, which we'll touch on a little later. Similarly, the fort was constantly questioned by rivals of those who held the seigneurie or were in charge of the fort, predominantly because it was very expensive. For example, in 1 year, the upkeep of Fort Frontenac cost approximately 8,000 livres, which was about the salary of 80 soldiers, which was far more than the soldiers that were actually living there. And this didn't include actually paying the soldiers that were living at the fort. It would be destroyed in 1689 by the French after a siege that left the fort in a ruin, but it would be rebuilt in 1695 upon the insistence of one man, Count Frontenac. So he is the Governor General of New France. He serves 2 terms, which is actually unheard of for governors. He's essentially one of the only ones to actually do this. First, from 1672 to 1681, and then from 1689 to 1698. He also wished to expand New France, but specifically the Western fur trade. This was because he was incredibly invested in it, and he understood the fur trade to be New France's main form of income, and if it could bring in more money, it could become more powerful and then rival the English to the south. He was very hands-on as a governor. He often found himself traveling off into the upper country to meet with both the soldiers at the fort and Indigenous allies. The painting that's actually taken here, it's from his second term, but it's a sort of apocryphal story of him attending a rally with his Indigenous allies. But he was known to be willing to kind of get his hands dirty and was very hands-on, which made him very popular, but also allowed him a lot more leeway than quite a few other governors. He was personally invested in seeing the forts of the upper country succeed as part of his Western trading enterprise. This also led to him being very headstrong and stubborn. Governor Frontenac believed that the governor should be the ruler of New France. The government of New France was split between 3 individuals: the governor, the intendant, and the bishop. The governor of New France was really in charge of the military and settling, whilst the intendant was the judicial and economic minister, and the bishop saw to all things religious. However, he believed that the ministers, such as the intendants, were getting in his way, that they didn't actually understand what needed to be done, which led to him getting into quite a few conflicts with his intendant, especially one Jacques Duchesneau, who we'll talk about just a little bit later. He was hard to work with and very stubborn. He's bereaved with a lot of controversy in his time, to the point that he's actually asked to step down in 1681 and then is re-given the position in a time of extreme crisis. He was reliable and strong in crisis. He basically saves New France from disaster in the 1690s after a failed war against the Haudenosaunee. But he was also incredibly corrupt and self-serving. He was especially involved in the fur trade, which was illegal. The governor was not permitted to fur trade, but he had a lot of investments in the fur trade, including bank accounts in Boston and England, which was a very bad look for a governor of a French colony. So we're going to touch on just that, the illegal trade. So before we talk about the illegal trade, we need to talk about the fur trade, and it was incredibly restrictive. It had a lot of rules, regulations, monopolies, all controlling the flow of furs from New France all the way to Europe. So the fur trade was really restrictive because of two men. This is Intendant Jean Talon, and this is the Ministère des Finances Jean-Baptiste Colbert. So Jean Talon is the intendant. He's the first intendant of New France from 1663 onwards. He's really the post-royal takeover of that period. And Jean-Baptiste Colbert is his boss, in charge of the French economy and its sort of overseas possessions. So the trade was restricted for a number of reasons. Firstly, when they take over the colony in 1663, Jean-Baptiste Colbert and Talon find that the colony is sparsely populated, uninhabited, and all of its eggs are in one basket, the fur trade, which caused the Compagnie de Sans Associés, the previous ruling body of New France, to actually fail because of a number of reasons. So they kind of step back and assess the problem. They notice that New France is sparsely populated. For example, when Jean Talon takes a census in 1665, he finds that New France only has a population of approximately 3,215 people. To put this into context, its rival in New England has a population of approximately 20,000. New France would only reach this population level in 1718, when New England had a population of 90,000 people. In New York, its other main rival also had a larger population despite being nearly 40 years younger as a colony. Similarly, they wanted to encourage settlement. This is what the demographic problem was. So they made a number of regulations to ban people from trading externally. Oftentimes, settlers would leave the colony, go into the upper country, and trade with indigenous traders and bring back furs. This was seen as a problem because it encouraged a nomadic or itinerant lifestyle amongst French settlers who were spending more time in the upper country than farming, which is what they wanted the primary economy to be, farming or agriculture, shipbuilding, and lumber. So they pass approximately 7 different ordinances from 1663 all the way to 1681 to try and limit the external trade. They also wanted to encourage indigenous settlement. Instead of going to get furs from indigenous traders, they decided, why don't we just invite them to New France, show them the glory of French civilization, and then perhaps they will settle here. Similarly, they wanted to monopolize the fur trade. They wanted to control where the furs were coming from, who had access to those furs, and where those furs ended up. If people went out into the upper country, you couldn't actually regulate where they were going. So, prevent people from going out and bring the furs directly to you. Now, you may be wondering, what makes an illegal fur trader then? Well, firstly, trading externally. This is predominantly from 1663 to 1681. So this is leaving the bounds of the colony, abandoning settlement, not farming, not trading, or not trading internally. So they pass a number of legislation to block this from happening. They put soldiers at the borders, which are ill-defined and very difficult to enforce. But from 1681 onwards, Jean-Baptiste Colbert realizes that this system is not working. People are just ignoring these regulations. They're still going out, they're still trading. The draw of the fur trade, which was incredibly lucrative, is still very high. So the French institute the congé system. A congé was a license, which the governor would be responsible with giving out. They were responsible to give out 25 licenses to approved merchants who would then outfit their own expeditions, or voyageurs, to go out and trade and bring back furs from approved trading partners, which was very important. They wanted to encourage alliances with those that they were friendly with and knock out those who they were not friendly with. However, this system was incredibly corrupt, to say the least. For example, Governor Labarre, who is Governor de Frontenac's successor, issues a stunning 135 licenses in 1684, far over the limit. And even with this license system in place, people were still leaving the colony. Similarly, trading in liquor or guns was also illegal. Liquor was actually legalized by Jean Talon after it had been illegalized by the Jesuits in the area. However, it was incredibly frowned on by the church, who saw it as encouraging drunkenness and sin amongst Indigenous people in a sort of paternalistic view of things. They believed that alcohol was spreading sin and pushed them away from the ideal of French civilization and conversion, which was really their goal with conversion. So it's re-illegalized in 1678, but illegal fur traders still use it as a source of income because it was so lucrative. And last but certainly not least, trading outside the monopoly, which basically trading either with enemies of New France, so the English or the Dutch or the Spanish or anybody who those furs could reach, or not going through the proper channels, i.e. trading with the company that held the monopoly in the fur trade, which was usually La Compagnie des Indes Occidentales, or the West India Company. But all of these activities were done by one group of people who l'intendant Jacques Duchesneau discusses in this quote. This conduct has filled the woods with runners and vagabonds, between 500 and 800, who have abandoned their families and the cultivation of the land, and who have accustomed themselves to the libertine behavior and debauchery of the natives. Every family in Canada finds themselves connected with the Coureurs de Bois. So who is the Coureurs de Bois? Well, this is a wooden engraving of Pierre Esprit Radisson and his brother-in-law, Médard de Grozier, who were both two illegal fur traders in the pre-royal takeover, and who actually helped found the Hudson's Bay Company with the English after being spurned by the French. And they really are considered to be Coureurs de Bois. So the Coureurs de Bois are French men living amongst Indigenous people. They have abandoned, in the eyes of the French, the customs of French civilization and go amongst Indigenous peoples for a realistically less restrictive and honestly more liberating life than the pseudo-feudal lifestyle of an habitant in New France. They are considered rogue agents by the French, that is, unreliable agents of empire who only aid the empire when it suits them, which leads to a number of very colorful interpretations of them. They often broke regulations of the trade. Now, this is not, just to keep in mind, this is not a universal or monolithic group. A Coureurs de Bois is really an umbrella term for anybody trading externally and who really shirks the French standard of how the fur trade should operate. They are considered a boogeyman or a force of moral corruption. They are a spiritual and moral threat. They encourage, as I mentioned, libertine and debauched behavior amongst French settlers and Indigenous peoples alike. And they were seen to really harm the conversion of Indigenous people by trading in alcohol, which they found to be the most effective way to gain their furs to then trade illegally with the French or otherwise. They also traded with enemies of the colonies, such as the English or the Dutch, and oftentimes made compacts with them to really get protection from the French, who would have punished them rather harshly. This all leads to a number of very colorful quotes about them, which I will now read. For example, in 1672, Jean-Baptiste Patoulet, the intendant Jean Talon's minister, reads, "These people do not marry, never work to clear the land, commit an infinite number of disorders through their libertine life and harm the conversion of the Indians. An unnamed king's official in 1678, looking at the brandy trade in New France, says, even when blocked from attending Sunday Mass and chastised by the church, they continue to trade in brandy with little care. Denonville, the governor after Governor Frontenac, says, they encourage amongst our settlers and indigenous people alike a spirit of libertine independence. And an unnamed missionary in 1697 has to say, they encouraged drunkenness and immorality amongst indigenous peoples and encouraged others to join them. Oftentimes, the government tried to combat this by offering amnesty. Though this was rarely taken seriously by the Coureurs de Bois, they would often take amnesty, accept it, and then immediately go back to what they were doing, much like the buccaneers of Saint-Domingue, who they're actually often compared to. As Frontenac once remarks in 1696, they will never reduce themselves to plowing. So really, they were seen as debauched and really corrupting influences, and punishments could be severe. For example, Laborde, the governor, refers to them as an evil so considerable in a letter to one of his soldiers when being sent to Michilimackinac to try and curb the expansion of Coureurs de Bois in that area. Similarly, as a 1682 ordinance passed by Laborde also mentions, any who leave our dwellings to trade amongst the Indians will suffer pain of confiscation of their goods and canoes, as well as penalty through slavery among the galleys, which was basically slavery in the French Navy in the Mediterranean, rowing galleys, essentially until you either finished your term or you were worked to death. So it was a very brutal way. For merchants who were caught associating with them, they could expect something a little more lenient, which was a fine of about 1,500 livres for every applicable infraction caught dealing with the Coureurs de Bois. And for example, Jean Soumand, a merchant in 1707, is actually recorded as having been punished in this way. These efforts are largely unsuccessful, as you might imagine. The upper country is incredibly difficult to police, and itinerant traders were very difficult to catch. They were not staying in one place. They had networks protecting them. And as Intendant Duchesneau says, the woods give them great capabilities to evade justice. As I mentioned before, they're often compared to the buccaneers of the Caribbean, which is actually going to be the topic, hopefully, of my own thesis in my PhD. As Frontenac says, the disorder caused by the Coureurs de Bois will become, if we do not take action, like the bandits of Naples or the buccaneers of Saint-Domingue. Their numbers grow every day. And much like buccaneers and privateers in this period, the French actually still made use of them, legally or otherwise. And all sides of the French political system, no matter which faction in New France you were on, used them. This is especially true with Governor Frontenac, and mostly also located at the place that holds his name, Fort Frontenac. So this is a map of Fort Frontenac from about the early 18th century, so just about when we're studying here. We have the fort right here, we have the grange, the farms here, and you have then the indigenous peoples that sort of lived, hopefully we're going to live nearby for conversion. So Fort Frontenac was perfectly located for the illegal fur trade. It had connections with Albany, New York, and the upper country, meaning that it was able to send or receive furs from just about anywhere. It was an illicit entrepot, meaning a place where goods were stored. It would be supply and purchase goods for Coureurs de Bois to then trade, and Coureurs de Bois were often found trading here. Fort Frontenac was just one step in a part of a wider illegal fur trading network as well, which we'll actually talk on a little later. And this illegal trade really sabotaged its aforementioned duties, as I mentioned earlier. while they were supposed to focus on defending the colony, on trade, or on converting Indigenous people, they actually were predominantly focusing on trade, and this actually ultimately undermined a lot of military campaigns. For example, in 1684, Labarre, the governor of Fort Frontenac, but of New France, and a man who had a lot of investment in Fort Frontenac, declared war on the Haudenosaunee in an attempt to curb their participation in the fur trade and to justify after they attacked a lot of fur traders on Lake Ontario. And there's actually a whole conspiracy about this that I'll kind of talk on later about the illegal fur trade and the general fur trade and how intermeshed in the underworld it was. But in this campaign, de Meul, who is actually Labarre's intendant, who also really hates his guts because he was really corrupt and de Meul wasn't, or at least he considered himself not to be, reported that barks meant for logistics to bring supplies, food, weapons, and goods across Lake Ontario into Iroquois were oftentimes being used by soldiers to instead carry trade goods and furs from the fort to Montreal or elsewhere. And eventually the campaign fails in part because of this, because they were incredibly undersupplied and caught in a really bad place, which leads to a humiliating surrender by the French, and then Labarre is actually kicked out of office and replaced by Denonville. So, this figure here, this is a French militiaman in about the 1750s, but he does represent a good idea of who was predominantly illegally fur trading at New France. And that was the soldiers at Fort Frontenac. Soldiers were garrisoned all across forts in the upper country, with about 50 to 100 being garrisoned here at Fort Frontenac. They were predominantly here for colonial policing and defense. That being said, they were predominantly also participating in the trade. As I mentioned before, the Labarre expedition of 1684 was actually theorized to have been started over the illegal fur trade and ultimately undermined by it. But another expedition which was caused by this was the Denonville expedition, which only takes place 3 years later, and it kind of plays a darker part of Fort Frontenac's history, where a number of sachems of the Haudenosaunee are invited to Fort Frontenac under a flag of peace, but they are all seized by Denonville's forces and sold into galley slavery, where only 17 of them are ultimately ever returned to New France. And it's believed Denonville had done this in part because of the Haudenosaunee attacks on French fur trading in the area. This also directly leads to the burning of Fort Frontenac in reprisal for this brutal invasion of Iroquois by the French and the eventual destruction and eventual rebuilding but loss of relevance of the fort. Now you may ask, why did these soldiers trade? And really, it's simple. Soldiers of the 17th and 18th century were paid awful wages. They were paid approximately 12 livres a month, or just about 100 livres a year, which is the average really salary of a tradesman or a farmer. But it's important to keep in mind that these wages were rarely ever delivered to the forts. It's very difficult to send money trains out into the upper country by boat, especially when they sink to the bottom of Lake Ontario or otherwise. So that meant that soldiers often went unpaid. For example, Frontenac remarks in 1698, "It is impossible to have commandants and soldiers at these posts live on salary alone." And this was a letter to the King of France himself, King Louis XIV, who was furiously demanding why soldiers were breaking his edicts not to trade in the upper country. Commandants also were very flexible and forced to be. The illegal fur trade was part of a system of alliances with Indigenous people, and there was a general anxiety amongst these soldiers that if they stopped trading, this would break alliances with Indigenous people who would go to the English and thus ruin the entire enterprise of New France. And I can count more than on my fingers the amount of letters that Frontenac sends to the crown insisting that the fur trade and the external fur trade should be continued, because if they don't, Indigenous allies will go to New York, and in rather apocalyptic terms, the entire enterprise will be destroyed. Similarly, clamping down on the illegal fur trade was worrying, as it feared alienation of Indigenous allies, seizing Indigenous porters, or their people who really spent a lot of time with them and were very friendly with them could antagonize them in a way that New France realistically could not afford. So one soldier who we're going to talk about here is Louis de la Porte de Louvigny. He is a professional soldier. He comes to New France in 1683. He fights in several wars with the Haudenosaunee, where he earns himself a reputation as a brave, reliable soldier. He is given the post of Michelimackinac as a reward, though it's also because he's paying 500 livres a year to Frontenac to have it. He eventually becomes the commandant of Fort Frontenac, and his first winter in Fort Frontenac, he trades illegally. So much so that he gets caught by the authorities and is not only taken before a civil court, but before the King of France himself to ask why he shouldn't be dishonorably discharged, stripped of everything he owns, and sent to the galleys. But he's actually found innocent. He pleads a very powerful case that he was a reliable soldier, a war hero, and the King of France takes his testimony and the testimony of many Haudenosaunee who he had traded with to let him go, and he eventually becomes a seigneur of a seigneurie out in Gaspé. But Louis de la Porte de Louvigny really also represents Frontenac's belief of how the fur trade existed, that it was necessary, ultimately, the illegal fur trade, to keep New France running. But New France and Fort Frontenac wasn't only a local enterprise, it was also part of a global network. Fort Frontenac locally was very important, but on a global scale was just one of many different forts and stopover points for furs, both illicit and otherwise, to reach, well, Europe. Predominantly in the local networks, it bypasses the company, la Compagnie des Indes Occidentales. It either takes furs directly to merchants in Montreal rather than the company itself, who will then ship them to France, or it also bypasses the company and sends them south to Albany. L'Île Percée, which is on the tip of Gaspé in modern-day Nova Scotia, was actually one of the major ports that Fort Frontenac furs usually ended up. Ships would then leave from L'Île Percée with these illegal furs from Fort Frontenac, and they would end up usually in Europe. France or Spain, and actually the seigneur of Fort Frontenac, who we're going to just about talk about now, actually would ship furs to Spain as well as the Netherlands and England. That man is Charles Aubert de Lachenay. So Charles Aubert de Lachenay is born Charles Aubert in 1632. He is a merchant, financier, and seigneur. He owns multiple seigneuries here in New France. He was a member of Le Conseil Souverain, that's the ruling council and body of New France. And he also is a founder of La Compagnie du Nord, the rival to the Hudson's Bay Company. When the French actually realized that they maybe should have listened to Père Esprit de Radisson, and instead of ignoring him about tapping into the Hudson's Bay, they should try and reach it, though they find, unfortunately, for his bank account, that it is a failed endeavor. He takes over Fort Frontenac from De La Salle in 1682. He essentially steals it out from under him because De La Salle was allied with Governor Frontenac, but when Governor Frontenac was kicked out, he lost his major patron, La Barre, who was a rival of Frontenac, and by extent, then also La Salle gives it to de Lachenay, who is his really major financier and supporter. Now, the king actually intercedes on La Salle's part and demands to know why he's getting letters from La Salle, insisting that he has had his land stolen from him. But La Barre claims, well, actually, his contract did go up, and through a number of loopholes, he's able to justify it, and the king just shrugs his shoulders, gives it to de Lachenay, and he turns it into his own entrepot for his illegal fur trading enterprises, which he was definitely involved in. For example, de la Chesnaye had a trading license from the governor of New York, which was actually produced in an investigation of the man himself by one of his rivals. Similarly, he smuggled furs both through Fort Frontenac and La Compagnie du Nord to l'Île Percée, where in a number of letters it is reported that his furs are being seized and reinvested into the colony. He was also allegedly part of the major conspiracy, which I actually mentioned earlier, and he's actually the centerpiece of it. The conspiracy goes that de la Chesnaye influenced Labarre to allow certain Haudenosaunee raiders to attack certain French fur traders that didn't possess his personal license, whilst also then protecting his own merchants to either pass to Fort Frontenac or onwards, or to actually bring their furs to New York. This is actually presented by l'intendant de Meule first in the 1680s, and then it's dredged up again just before his death in 1702. But the conspiracy is generally accepted by historians to be rather fanciful, that he would encourage and ally himself with the Haudenosaunee, only to then later on encourage Labarre to declare war on them, though then the conspiracy justifies this by saying that it was only because his own fur trading assets were being attacked rather than his rivals. But it's a really crazy conspiracy that just goes to show both the factionalism and the wild sort of character of the illegal fur trade. His reputation does remain relatively intact, and upon his death through a number of financial crises, he's still a very wealthy man. In 1702, he has a net value of approximately 800,000 livres, which is about 23 million Canadian dollars today, and this is after a number of economic losses. He's rarely, if ever, punished for his crimes in New France, and this is predominantly because of the fact that he, as an investor, reinvested a lot of his illegal money into the colony, predominantly in shipbuilding and lumber enterprises, but also in fisheries, infrastructure, and generally ways to clean that money and launder it, essentially, which meant that the authorities of New France really didn't like questioning him on this money because, well, it's a bad look to go after your chief financier and the man who's realistically keeping your economy floating. So he generally manages to get away with it. So why was this trade so prolific both at Fort Frontenac and in New France in general? Firstly, it is corruption at all levels. Corruption in colonial really bodies is very high, especially for self-gain. Being located in the upper country similarly, Fort Frontenac is very difficult to realistically police, and to hold its garrison accountable is similarly quite difficult. Similarly, as its illegal fur traders are very difficult to hold accountable, it generally ends up meaning that you can't really actually take them to account, so that they can just continue and everybody continues to benefit. Similarly, company men, governors, merchants, lawmakers, soldiers, they all had a stake in it. And reluctantly or willingly, they understood that it did benefit the colony in some part. Many benefited from this. For example, Governor de Frontenac really liked the illegal fur trade in the fur trade because he was a very lavish, very extravagant man. He is of the French court of France, which means he's a very wealthy man, and he believed that his salary of 24,000 livres a year just wasn't enough for him, so he really trades illegally both to feed his and his wife's lavish tastes, holds lavish parties in Montreal and in Quebec City, and undermines basically the entire monopoly for it. Similarly, de la Chesnaye's investments into the colony through the illegal trade had an unspoken understanding that even if he was trading illegally, the colony was inevitably benefiting from it. So even if the company was going under because of it, well, the enterprise of New France still works out. So it's deal with the devil you know, the devil you don't. And last but certainly not least, soldiers really, as I mentioned before, they needed that money, and they weren't getting paid reliably enough or on time, if ever. So trading illegally definitely benefited them as well. So to conclude, in 1715, Governor Claude de Ramsay and Intendant Michel Bégon, in a letter to the Ministère des Finances, reluctantly admit that the fur trade illegally was beneficial to the colony, even in undermining their authority. And this is really representative of the general view of the illegal fur trade in New France and at Fort Frontenac. It was something that was undermining authority, it was bad, but the colony in the end benefited. Even as Fort Frontenac continued to be a decrepit fort, rarely funded, the lands around it were not farmed at all, or as King Louis records in 1682, a land that is desolate with the greater portion of its animals dead. It was something that the authorities of New France, even if they wanted to, could not really stop. And this allowed Fort Frontenac to continue operating in this way, essentially until its destruction in 1759 by the English and its eventual reconstruction. Despite its fall from grace, I do believe that Fort Frontenac really acts as one of New France's most interesting and relevant pieces of history, and it gives us a good introductory view into the underworld, the underbelly of France's criminal enterprises in the area, and a very unexpected and a little, I guess, unorthodox part of Kingston's history. And I think it is very important to learn and discuss this, especially as Fort Frontenac's bones now sit at the foundations of Kingston, which is a history, or a very history-filled city, which I have come to know and love. But thank you so much for coming. I really hope you enjoyed this talk. Here are my primary sources, of which I have quite a few, my secondary sources here as well, and all of the references for my images. But I do hope you enjoyed this presentation.